That's a very important question.
President Cyril Ramaphosa formally announced the need for a national dialogue.
Permission. Consent can be withdrawn.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Pathways to Peace. Today we are joined by Professor Murithi, the head of Peacebuilding Interventions. Today's episode will explore how transitional justice can help reshape multilateralism by addressing historical injustices and ensuring a more inclusive and equitable representation in global institutions. Professor, how can transitional justice help reform the UN, more especially the Security Council, to address its unfairness and Africa's exclusion?
Thank you, Nandi, and thank you for having me on. As you know, transitional justice deals with addressing the historical injustices of the past, including exclusion from certain processes and marginalization of certain groups or constituencies. And transitional justice has at least 5 pillars that we can describe. The first is recovering the truth of what happened in the past and documenting that. So you see this happening in truth commissions and so on. The second is undertaking some processes that will redress the injustices that have been uncovered by the truth. This includes retributive and punitive, what we call criminal justice processes, where the perpetrators are prosecuted in a court of law. And that is also accompanied by restorative justice processes, which perpetrators go through a process of truth-telling and reconciling, if you will, of coming to terms with what they have done, acknowledging the harm they have done as a means to reconciling with the victims and survivors. The other element, the third element, is a process of reparations or restitution for harms that have been done in the past, which means repairing, rehabilitating, and compensating victims and survivors of past injustices. And the last element is institutional reform, so that institutions that were used in the past to exclude or oppress or suppress become more inclusive in the future. And this involves obviously elements of constitutionalism, development of constitutions to protect the rights of everybody within society. It includes the reform of the democratic system, the reform of the judicial system, the reform of the security sector, military and intelligence institutions, which could have been used to abuse, people in the past. So and all of those combined, all of those processes are the ones that lay the foundation for what we call reconciliation or peace building going forward. When we transpose this framework of transitional justice to the global stage, right? And we apply it specifically to the United Nations system. So the United Nations system was established in June 1945, and at that time only 3 African countries were present in the formation of that structure of the United Nations structure. And
what were those countries?
The countries were Ethiopia, Egypt, and Liberia. South Africa was there, but it was under the yoke of apartheid. White supremacist apartheid, so we don't consider it as having been independent or inclusive of the people of South Africa. So based on that, it's clear that Africa was marginalized at the beginning of the creation of the current multilateral system, as we say, anchored by the United Nations system. More specifically, the United Nations Security Council, where we have a distribution of power amongst what we call the permanent 5 members, the United States, France, Britain, China, and Russia. And also other institutions of the United Nations system, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which constitute the global financial architecture, and as well as more recently the WTO, or what we call the World Trade Organization. And in all of these institutions, you see the asymmetry of power or the imbalance of power between those who created the system and the majority of the rest of the world. The United Nations has grown from 51 countries in 1945 to now 93 countries, 193 countries, I should say. And it's clear that Africa is one of the largest blocks within the United Nations system. We are a total of 54 countries at the UN. Out of 193, it's a significant group of countries. Yet, when we focus in on the United Nations Security Council, you will see that there are 5 permanent members who have rights to veto decisions of the UN Security Council, and 9 members who are elected on a rotating basis every 2 years. And Africa is amongst those 9 and has 3 representatives within that system. But the majority of the agenda of the UN Security Council focuses on Africa. Almost 60% of it focuses on Africa. And the P5 have the ability to veto on issues. And that means that Africans are almost within this framework bystanders and spectators in decisions that affect them. And 100%, 1.4 billion people across the continent. And countries like Britain and France, which have the veto, are only 67 million each, compared to, and they have the veto, and compared to an African continent of 1.4 billion people that has no single veto or ability to actually really effectuate decisions at the Security Council. So now we use the transitional justice framework, which is all about redress of historical exclusion and redress of marginalization, and apply it to the UN Security Council more specifically. It is clear there's a very strong case for the transformation of the United Nations Security Council. And we have been advocating for this for quite some time now. And we are specifically focusing on Article 109 of the United Nations Charter, which calls for the convening of a general conference to review the United Nations Charter, which was adopted in 1945. And those 80 years up to today, it has never been reviewed. The Charter has never been reviewed. So we're making this case. It's a moral case. There is a political case, and there's a very strong legal case based on the United Nations Charter itself, Article 109, which calls for this review. So that is how we use the transitional justice prism, so to speak, to interrogate the exclusionary nature of the current global multilateral system, United Nations Security Council in particular. And Africans have been advocating for this change, and we shall continue to do so going forward.
How can African civil societies and think tanks like IGR help shape the global policies on justice and multilateral reforms?
So this is work that we are doing at the moment. IJR as a civil society actor, think tank that positions itself, in the field of transitional justice and peace building, has played a role in raising issues around the need to transform the institutions that were adopted way back during the era of colonialism. And our IGR continues to do so. And the important function of civil society actors and think tanks like the IGR is to actually raise awareness and to increase the understanding of the need for this transformation. For example, not many people know about Article 109 in the United Nations Charter. And I recommend all viewers and listeners to actually spend some time to read it. It's only 3 short paragraphs that shows you the pathways that we can adopt to transforming the United Nations system and increasing the level of global democracy around the world. So that is a function that that civil society actors and think tanks can play. This year in May 2024, the United Nations convened what they called a civil society conference which was a conference that was leading to the United Nations Summit of the Future that took place in September 2004 in New York. And IJR was a co-convener of what we now call the United Nations Coalition on Charter Reform, UNCRC. IJR partnered with Oxfam International, with Baha'i International, with the support of Campaign for UN, to convene a meeting, to convene this coalition in Nairobi at the UN conference. And since then, the coalition has been working diligently behind the scenes to advocate for this transformation of the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council, as I've just described. So that's a very clear example of how IJR, working with partners, continues to do this important work.
Thank you so much, Prof, for coming and sharing your expertise and your knowledge. Next time, we will dive more into the crisis of leadership and explore more on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nande, for having me.